Welcome to Liberty Starship, where we go beyond the typical terrestrial talk. I am Eric Alexander, along with Peter Maines. Together, we are your crew and invite you to join us on the journey to discuss politics and current events. So, today we're going to go ahead and start out with daily distractions, and we actually have more than one today. And it sounds like we might have kind of both intentions of this hashtag that we have here, because we're going to start out with some monkey business, right, Pete?
That is right. Let me just bring this up on the screen here. As we've been telling you now for weeks, the monkey apocalypse is upon us. The monkey uprising has started, and you need to be ready to protect yourself and your family from monkeys who are stealing COVID-19 blood samples from a lab technician in India. The video went viral on social media, and I think everybody has seen this, but we were warning you about the monkey gangs in Thailand earlier this year, that the monkeys don't have enough to eat because, of course, all the tourists are gone. We've been warning you about the attacks by anti-MAGA monkeys in India who don't want our President Donald Trump to visit there. But this time, there are no monkey catapults, no monkey gangs. You just have, a small gang of monkeys who broke into a lab. They don't want this research being done, ending the COVID-19 threat. And I would just say to people out there, you have to decide whose side you're on, us or the monkeys. And that's about it. There have been so many monkey stories this year. It's been hilarious. You can really everybody is doing this thing with the news. I don't know if you've noticed it, and I've been kind of poking a little bit of fun at this, but people are taking stories, mashing them together, and creating their own fanfic of the real world. And I think it's just amazing we can do this with the monkeys. Absolutely, yeah. Blood
Well, it's
samples
funny.
are just. Hmm?
Well, it's funny because, of course, we had quite a theme going for a little while where we were talking about all these different monkey stories, and then for a while that kind of went dark. I'm kind of glad
Just
to see that
petered
you found
out.
one of these stories again.
Yeah, yeah. It just sort of tailed off.
Now, what is the source of this particular news story, Pete?
This is live science, although it was reported all over the news. I think every major publication newspaper seemed to have this story because it went absolutely viral, as the headline says.
I'm curious. So I can see the headline. Obviously, monkey steals COVID-19 blood samples from a lab technician in India.
Right.
And is there some well, I can't say legitimate, but is there some concern that the sample is going to be used to contaminate other animals, people? I mean, is that kind of the angle of this particular article?
Well, I think the big concern is if they're setting up their own labs and if they're going to beat us in the race to build the first vaccine. But no, I don't think so. As far as we know, monkeys aren't actually susceptible to COVID-19.
That's
And
interesting because cats are. I know that
yeah,
cats are.
and clearly bats are, and a lot of animals, but I haven't heard of any monkeys being infected with it. And there's been, as we said, there's been a lot of monkey stories in the news. So if they are susceptible, it's not all that common. But yeah, they say right here in the article, 2 pet cats and a pet dog in the U.S. have also tested positive for the coronavirus, which they likely contracted from contact with people. Well, that's not a big surprise. It's not a big surprise. It jumped from probably bats, or some people have said pangolins. We're not 100% sure, but clearly humans seem to be the species most impacted by the virus so far.
And you did mention that a more, I guess, serious part of this article was that they were talking about the race to actually get a vaccine for COVID. Is that also part of the coverage here?
Well, yeah, these blood samples, obviously they're doing research, and so the monkeys grabbing the blood samples is not helpful because we there's time is lives in this case, right? The longer it takes to get to the bottom of producing a vaccine, the more people will die. So
I
yeah, that's
see.
the
Well, the monkey business again.
Yeah.
As I've mentioned previously, obviously daily distractions was originally meant as a way for us to kind of look at some of the coverage, the specific coverage of different news stories. And
Hmm.
of course, what it's evolved into is, at least in part, we often end up talking about things that are kind of silly, funny, something to kind of get people's minds off of everything else. Getting back to the more serious side of it, I have this article from CNN, and the headline reads In Huntington Beach, a George Floyd protest was deemed an unlawful assembly. A stay at home protest 1 month ago was not. So, of course, the way this article is framed is to show a contrast between the way that this particular writer, who is Saba Hamidi, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that right, along with Alexandra Meeks. They write this article, and what they're talking about is the Huntington Beach protests that occurred a couple weeks ago in regards to the beaches being closed and people being upset about the specific orders that were put in place. One of the interesting aspects of that, by the way, was that what had happened was several beaches in California had been opened at that time. And then there were some images that were like this one. There were some images that were revealed that showed a massive amount of people congregating on the beach. And then Governor Newsom specifically closed down Huntington Beach. Now, after this, there was a rather massive protest. And of course, at least from my perspective, the governor's Newsom's order was completely ineffective because it did exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to do. People weren't congregating on the beach. Instead, they were congregating in a huge protest. And most of them were not wearing masks. Obviously, most of them were not practicing any kind of social distancing. So it had the complete opposite effect of what Governor Newsom had actually intended. Now, the way that this article sort of treats things is they're trying to show a contrast between how that particular protest was treated as opposed to the more recent protests that have occurred in regards to the death of George Floyd. So the George Floyd protests, and basically trying to say that, well, they didn't really, didn't treat the George Floyd protesters with the same, I guess, respect as they treated the lockdown protesters, and basically trying to imply that part of it is because this is Orange County, and these the other protesters were Republicans, and the George Floyd protesters are perceived as more Democrats, and all sorts of silly things like that. Well, I went ahead and did a little bit of research, and it only took me about 5 seconds with Google. That's all it took me to do, 5 seconds. And then I found another report related to this same story. And this is from the local, one of the local network affiliates in the area. So this one is from ABC7, which covers that particular area of the country, basically LA, Orange County, that entire area. And this headline, which was actually done early this morning, reads, Orange County protests, gatherings in Huntington Beach, Santa Ana broken up by police. So this one is a short article just detailing the fact that there were some violent protests in Huntington Beach and Santa Ana. And this is the part that I think is really, really interesting. So it says in Huntington Beach, about 500 people gathered around Pacific Coast Highway and Main Street, including a number of counter protesters. As conflicts between the two groups escalated, police declared an unlawful assembly and asked people to disperse. So, in fact, the protesters, very likely the lockdown protesters, were at this particular demonstration. They apparently started to fight with the George Floyd protesters, and that's why we had an unlawful assembly. And that's not in the CNN article at all. At all. The fact that there was this confrontation between the two different groups. And that's why I say it's a distraction.
So, CNN, you said, did not report that that there was a fight between the two groups of protesters.
No, they didn't even acknowledge the fact that there was any kind of counter protest going on. That's not even part of the story. They don't even mention it. All they do is show the quote unquote contrast between the way that the George Floyd protesters were treated as opposed to the lockdown protesters, not mentioning that apparently the lockdown protesters showed up at the other protests and they started fighting. And that's very obvious in this article that that's what happened, is that there was a conflict between the two groups, which interestingly enough, I would like to mention that we haven't heard a lot of counter-protesting news. And that's kind of been somewhat surprising to me. It's not completely surprising to me, but I haven't heard a lot of stories about counter-protesters and people, like say Blue Lives Matters or anything like that. I haven't heard anything like that. This is the first time I've heard anything, and it's just this very small blurb in this particular article. But I want to just point out, again, the reason that I call this a daily distraction is it took me 5 seconds to Google this and find this out. And CNN couldn't be bothered to mention that, yes, it looks like those same protesters that they're saying were treated with kid gloves, because that's basically the slant of the article, is that the lockdown protesters were treated with kid gloves. The George Floyd protesters were run off with tear gas. No, it looks like they were both there at the same time and started to fight with each other. At least that's what it looks like according to this article here.
Now, are you saying, to just back up a second, that you think there are a lot more counter protests going on than are being reported on?
I'm saying I'm surprised that I haven't heard another story like this. This is the first one I've heard. I don't know if you've heard of any other stories like that, Pete, but this is the first one that I've heard. And I had to do a little bit of digging to find it. And I don't understand why it wasn't in the much larger. This article is very small, by the way. You can kind of see as I scroll through it. I mean, that's it.
Right.
That's all there is. It's a very short blurb. There is video. There is some extensive video. You can see, obviously, that there are police cruisers out here. The police did take an intersection there. And you can see that there are people gathered all around. But there isn't very much in terms of the article itself. There's very little. And I just feel like it's incredibly telling to me that CNN would completely omit this story, because to me it is a big story. And again, it's not that they're not covering something, or that they are covering something that I don't think is worthy of their coverage. It's the way they're covering it and the obvious spin they have to that coverage. And again, this is a big story, just not the way that CNN framed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much news going on right now. It's really hard to get a handle on what matters and what doesn't. Stories that you would have thought would have been a lot bigger are just completely down the memory hole. Even the president fighting with Twitter, threatening to shut down Twitter this week. That story has basically taken the back seat, has been put on the back burner because you have these riots going on. It's just sucking up all the oxygen.
Absolutely. And that's going to be one of our main segments today, because we're going to be talking about that in detail a little bit later.
Yep. So, well, I have a story I'd like to share. And this one is kind of funny, kind of sad. Michigan man plans to steal helicopter for hospital attack to free COVID-19 patients, police say. And this is the most 2020 story I think I've seen all year. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so sad. Let's just look at this winner right here. Here's the suspect who is taken into custody, and he looks like he's rather surprised to have been arrested. Now, his plan was to steal a Coast Guard helicopter, attack a police station, which he did. He rammed a truck into a police station, and when he just couldn't get in, he called their transportation communications department. It was some kind of a phone number, and he asked that they let him in to the police station. Absolutely mind-blowing. The station communications center and demanded access, according to authorities. That didn't work out so well for him. His request was denied, so McFadden threatened to ram the gates open with his truck, court records show. And this happened on, let's see, the story is from the May 22nd and it is now June 1st. So it's been over a week since this story happened. And have you heard about it? I haven't heard about it until today. This is how crazy things have been over the past week and a half. That somebody trying to steal a Coast Guard helicopter, attack a police station. He wanted to free COVID-19 patients from quarantine. That's back of the newspaper type of stuff. That is nowhere near the front page. But in any normal week, of course, this would be the story. And I think that what this says about, I mean, first of all, about the crazy news cycle, but maybe more importantly, what it says about what's going on in our country right now, that people are inventing, and I don't just mean people who are way out off the deep end like this guy, but it's my observation that people are inventing their own fanfic of reality, like with the monkeys, like with the murder hornets, and people think that the masks are an attempt to impose Sharia law or all kinds of crazy stuff. This guy thinks that COVID patients are prisoners, and
Well, I
they need
suppose
to be freed.
I suppose in a sense he's right. I mean, they do quarantine COVID patients, don't they?
Yeah, they do. They do quarantine them. It is for their own protection. Oh no, that's what the Nazis said. No, I don't know.
Well, this reminds me. We didn't cover it on this program, but this reminds me. Around that same time, there was an incident where there was an individual who tried to ram a train into one of the hospital ships in Los Angeles. Do you remember that?
Yes. And how on earth do you ram a train into a ship?
Well, that was his intention. And he derailed it. I mean, he actually, and I believe that this was an actual train operator. This wasn't just some random deranged nut. It was an actual train conductor, if I remember correct. I mean, this was several weeks ago, and obviously a lot has happened since then. But it does remind me of that particular story. This one occurred in Michigan, correct?
Yeah, Saginaw, Michigan. And this
Right.
guy had been arrested before. He had been arrested for another felony involving firearms. And it looks like the article is a little vague, but it looks like he had previously spent a year in jail. So he's probably not going to get the most lenient sentence that he could have received. But yeah.
That is amazing.
You feel bad for the guy. He's clearly very disturbed. Arrested at a gas station. Not a mastermind of crime here.
But as you were saying, I think in any other time this would be like front page news. So, yeah. As you said, it is an interesting reflection of the times that we're living in right now. But again, it does remind me very much of a very similar situation regarding that train conductor that was trying to ram a hospital ship.
Which, I mean, I guess it says something that he was able to derail it. You would think it's not that easy to derail a train in these times and get that train anywhere near the hospital ship. So I hate to say he knew what he was doing, but it sounds like he knew what he was doing.
A little bit more than this guy did, which is, I guess, thankful that this person did not know what they were doing. So,
the Coast Guard didn't let them steal their helicopter, oddly enough.
And you would totally expect that they would, I mean, that's just...
Yeah, the Lend-Lease program.
Oh my.
Probably just sign it out, leave your driver's license. Why not?
Well, I have a much more serious story here that I think is going to lead into a much more serious topic, because we have talked about that we are going to talk about some of the attacks that have happened on police stations and the civil unrest that's going on right now. This is from the Military Times, and this is a very grim and interesting point, in terms of what's going on right now. One could say this could be the beginning of the point of no return. And so we have, says Louisville chief, police and National Guard enforcing curfew fatally shot a man after someone in a group fired at them. And it says that this article is from 8 hours ago. So it says Kentucky's governor on Monday called for the release of police video from a deadly shooting that took place while police officers and National Guard soldiers were enforcing a curfew amid waves of protests in the city over a previous police shooting. The city's police chief said the man was killed early Monday while police officers and National Guard soldiers returned fire after someone in a large group fired at them first. A witness said the group had nothing to do with the protest and was shocked to see soldiers arrive to disrupt their gathering. Never thought I would experience that here in America, Chris Smith said. Governor Andy Beshear said there's significant camera footage, body camera and otherwise, from the shooting, and pressed Louisville police to release the video as soon as possible. So again, this is a sort of a very grim milestone in the unrest that has been occurring just in this last week. It's amazing to think that we weren't talking about this at all a week ago, about any sort of riots or anything. Of course, we did talk about things that were going on with the lockdown protests and things of that nature. But I did want to make an interesting connection here that I think other news outlets are not really making. So we can see where this happened, right? This happened in Louisville, Kentucky. And I have another article here just to kind of give people a reminder that when you start thinking, like we were talking about the Huntington Beach situation a little while ago, and that somehow the lockdown protesters should be put in a completely different group than the George Floyd protesters. But here's where Louisville also made the news, and we talked about this before. Judge rules in favor of Louisville church, says mayor's ban on drive-in surface criminalized Easter. So this is only from, a few weeks ago that we were talking about these kinds of things. And it's kind of interesting to me that I don't see many news sources connecting these kinds of stories together, and the fact that they are connected, and that there is a similar thread that runs through both of these stories. Because in one situation, you have these protests that are going on, and to various degrees, they're turning violent, right? And then on the other hand, you have something like a church that was trying to meet in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, which experts say is still ongoing. We're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has not stopped because of the protests. It has not stopped because of the riots. It hasn't stopped because of any of those things. And so it's interesting to me that these connections are not being made in terms of these two stories. We're kind of being told that these two stories are not related to each other. And to me, they are. To me, they absolutely are. They run a common thread. And it's just interesting to me that we have these two very grim milestones in these two in the same place, in the very same place. It was a flashpoint in terms of religious freedom, in terms of religious rights, and now it seems to be a flashpoint in terms of people's right to assemble and the right to protest. What do you think of that, Pete?
I'm having trouble connecting a shooting with prohibiting people from going to church.
Well, the First Amendment includes your right to peaceably assemble, and it also includes your right to worship. And that's the connection, that's the glue. Just as it also includes freedom of the press. So these things are all connected in the First Amendment. And when we see controversy, when we see these fundamental rights being challenged in different ways, under different circumstances, obviously, but obviously in the same jurisdiction, I think that's something that should be pointed out. And that's something that's not being pointed out in the mainstream media. Instead, what we get are similar to the story I talked about earlier, the Huntington Beach situation, where it's like, well, the lockdowns are one thing, George Floyd is another. No, they're not. No, they're not. They are both liberty issues. They both involve the First Amendment. They both involve the application of the First Amendment. And you don't get to pick which parts of the First Amendment you like and which parts of the First Amendment you don't like. The coverage towards this story, when we talk about the Louisville church situation versus the coverage of this other story of this grim milestone where we've had an incident where the National Guard and police have shot somebody, they're absolutely connected in my mind. They're absolutely connected 100% because it all has to do with our liberties. It all has to do with our freedom.
Well, that's certainly true. Um, and yeah, I found it strange the amount of contempt that has been hurled at people who just want to go back to church. And we saw the Supreme Court this week ruled that, well, even though in Louisville, of course, you're now allowed to go to church again. The Kentucky court, the Kentucky judge struck down that order preventing people from going to church in Kentucky. But in California, the Supreme Court has now upheld that you cannot because it's within the governor's broad powers. And as we've said, this has been ongoing for months. This isn't an emergency order. This isn't what anybody would consider a legitimate emergency order at this point. What we're doing is allowing governors to make policy for months on end with very little judicial review, without very little restraint by the courts on what they can and cannot do. We're just handing them a blank check. Whatever you think is necessary, go ahead and do it. And that's absolute madness. Typically, you would think the standard would be something like this, that the policy or the law, the executive order, whatever it is, the instrument, it has to be narrowly tailored to achieve the government's aim. You should have to achieve the aim of, say, keeping people safe from COVID or trying to tamp down the riots in the least restrictive manner possible. And instead, what the courts have largely said, not always, not unanimously, some judges have been very reasonable on this, but what many of the courts have simply said is, you know what? We're not going to get in the way. Whatever you think is necessary, go ahead and do it. And that defeats the purpose of, we live in a free society. We live in a society where we have this constitution that ostensibly is supposed to protect us from arbitrary government like this.
I do want to point out, or I actually want some clarification, Pete, because I did hear about the story in California, but I didn't get into it in depth. That was the California Supreme Court that ruled in that particular case, correct?
No, it was the U.S. Supreme Court. John Roberts was the deciding vote. He was the swing vote. So it has gone as high as it can go.
That's shocking. That's I wasn't aware of that. No, I wasn't aware of that. So I guess Roberts once again does not know what the Constitution actually says. It honestly disgusts me because you can, again, my point is you cannot pick and choose what part of the First Amendment is important to you and what part is not. That's not the rule of law. The First Amendment covers freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and it covers freedom of worship. And if you're going to allow the press to keep doing their thing, you've got to let churches still do their thing. If you're going to allow protests, you've got to allow the other two. It's you don't get to pick and choose your parts of the Constitution that you like. That's just not acceptable. And it infuriates me that's become the status quo in our country, where people get to pick and choose.
Yeah. I think the Supreme Court is very hesitant to strike down laws or regulations or executive orders unless they feel very, very strongly about it, unless it's a very clear-cut case, because they don't want to be seen as a policymaking branch. They're trying to preserve the image of neutrality, meaning they're not picking sides between the parties, but of course their loyalty should be to the Constitution, not to the political status quo or the middle of the road wherever we are politically right now. That's their job, to apply the law as it is written, as it was originally intended. And
but these aren't even laws. These are emergency declarations that by their nature are supposed to be temporary.
Right, but the Constitution is the Constitution, though, is the supreme law of the land, and they're not applying the Constitution as it was written, as it was originally intended by its by its authors, by its framers.
It's very disappointing. Very disappointing.
Yeah, and we've said, I think when we first talked about this, we said, okay, the first step is you take this to court, but of course that isn't the end of it. If you're still not seeing progress, then I think the president or somebody, Congress, should look into other avenues for reining in these governors and mayors from doing what they're doing, because it is unconstitutional. And if the courts aren't willing to say so, um, there are levers that Congress may have at its disposal, or the president. You've said, hey, the federal marshal should go in and arrest some of these people. Well, maybe that's what you have to do. Unfortunately, because the courts have already ruled this way, the chances that the law would be enforced as as properly understood, because what's the end game here, right? You arrest them, you take them to court. The courts, which have already said this isn't against the law, are they going to rule that person guilty or not guilty? It seems pretty clear the courts are going to would it rule against the U.S. Marshals in that case. And so I think, I think there are some things that they could try, but their options are very limited now, unfortunately.
Well, there's only one option, which I would call the nuclear option, and that's to declare the state an insurrection, and then the federal government can essentially take over. That's really the only option you have there if the Supreme Court has already ruled on the issue. So
now, what would that entail if you have an order of insurrection? Where does that authority come from?
I believe it's a very old law. It's from I think 1807. I was actually reading an article about that not too long ago, because that discussion has come up quite a bit in the midst of COVID-19, and then of course it's come up quite a bit in the midst of all these riots. How the Insurrection Act works and the application of it. There's actually a fascinating story from George W. Bush where he talks about the Katrina situation and why he did what he did, and what his alternatives were. And he talked about this in his book, that his only alternative to overriding the governor and also the mayor, because the mayor of New Orleans did not want the federal government involved. They didn't want to listen to what the president at that time was trying to advise them to do. And he said his only real option was to declare an insurrection, and then he could just send the military in and evacuate the city and do whatever he wanted at that point. And he knew he would have been crucified for doing it, and that's why he didn't do it. So, and then of course he was criticized afterwards for not stepping in and doing anything. But that's the only way you can do it. That's the only way that you can, as the president of the United States, that is your only real recourse in a situation like that, is to declare an insurrection. And at that point, you can use the military, and it becomes military rule. It's again, like I said, that's very much a nuclear option at that point. But I don't know. At this point, it seems like the world is getting crazier and crazier. The country's getting crazier and crazier, and I don't know. That could be in the realm of possibility at this point. So we'll just, I guess, have to see.
Yeah, speaking of the world getting crazier and crazier, I've spent the last week, I don't know if you've been following my social media activity this past week, but I have spent a significant part of the last week trying to tamp down just crazy urban legends. People are posting things without even bothering to read the articles. So one of the big stories was the Minneapolis mayor has said that most or virtually all of the protesters who have been arrested have come from out of state. And it was a story on MSN.com, and I had at least two people share it with me. No, three. And these are people who are politically formed. They should know better. But if you actually read the article, at the very top, it said, update. Turns out this is all lies. Turns out once the reporters actually asked to look at the arrest records, these rioters are coming from within Minneapolis itself. But people have these narratives, and they're allowing their imaginations to run away with them. And so again, this is the thing. It's fanfic. This is fanfic where people are just taking shreds of stories. Hey, you have monkeys over here, and you have COVID over there, and you have rioters, and George Soros, and Bill Gates is going to drive around in his white van selling lollipops and vaccines. And, it's just so crazy. The president tweeted this: 80% of the rioters are from out of state. No, they're not. Now, if you're going to ship in rioters to instigate violence in a city, wouldn't you ship in like a couple dozen max? Wouldn't that make more sense than trying to fill an entire city full of paid protesters? Just get somebody to work the crowd a little bit and whip them up. But people are losing their minds. They're believing things that just on paper are not even plausible. So,
well, I think where that comes from is exactly what you're saying, is that there's a sense, and I think there's a legitimate sense, that many of the provocateurs, if you will, and the instigators of violence during these protests are not people that are representative of the community. And by that, I mean they don't live there. That's what I mean. I mean, they don't live in that particular area where they're rioting. This happened in my own community where we had riots right down the street from my house. And the fact of the matter was many of the people involved were from out of state. In fact, that was well documented. I even tagged you on one of those particular people that was clearly from out of state. And
yeah, actually, it was Jake Paul, the influencer. So he's a millionaire. He's a boxer. He's in town. He's bored. And what's he do? He riots.
So the fact of the matter is that there's clearly that element is there. The question becomes how much of it, and that's where I think it becomes exaggerated when you say something like 80%. Of course, it's not 80% of the people there are from out of state, but clearly there are people from out of state, or at least people that don't live in that community. That's the other part of it, is that's how things get exaggerated. Clearly, there are people participating in these protests that don't live in that particular community. They don't live in that neighborhood, for one, or they don't live in that particular city, and they may not live in that particular state. And I know that for a fact because of what happened here. So that's just, and those kinds of stories, of course, end up getting embellished. It's kind of like the telephone game, right? You start with one message, I say it to you, you say it to somebody else, and it becomes more and more distorted as it goes down the line. Right. The issue that you were talking about, it was the mayor that at first was saying these people are not from my state, and you would think the mayor, being the closest official, the one on the ground level, that he would know what he's talking about. You would assume that. I would assume that the mayor is the best person to talk to about what's going on. But of course, what happens so often is we don't realize, well, how involved is the mayor? Where is the mayor getting his information? Is the mayor even getting his information from anybody, or is he just making things up? That's the problem that we have. And of course, that gets to the very core of a lack of trust in government and a lack of transparency, because oftentimes we don't know where they're getting their information or anything like that. And because again, you would expect the mayor to be well informed if there's a riot in their city, that would be the person to talk to and find out what's going on.
Sure. And the people he blamed, he threw the police department under the bus. He said the police department gave him inaccurate information. I'm not sure I believe that. I can think of a few reasons why the police might want to lie to him. That is, they're trying to deflect blame, I think. But I think the truth is, so that's just a theory. I don't think that's what happened. I think what happened is the mayor wanted to deflect blame, and so he blamed it on out-of-state protesters, because then he doesn't look like he's losing control of a city. If it's outside nefarious forces brought in by George Soros or whoever you think wants to instigate riots inside of Minneapolis, then it's not his fault.
Well, the latest spin on that has been that these are white supremacists. I don't know if you've heard that story, but that's all over the place, that there are white supremacists marching right next to these George Floyd protesters who are predominantly black. Somehow they've infiltrated the movement, and they're the ones causing all the problems. And that to me is just ridiculous. I can't see how that situation could possibly occur.
It does seem kind of far-fetched. I thought about that, and I thought, well, maybe what's going on with that, if you're a white supremacist and you really hate black people, you want to cause trouble in black communities, you see that there's unrest, you decide that you're going to stir things up a little bit because you want something bad to happen to black communities. I don't know. That's all I can think of, but it does seem rather
It's
far-fetched.
ridiculous. It's a ridiculous notion. I've seen video where you can clearly see people that are clearly they're clearly the anarchist type. They're clearly the Antifa type, predominantly white, and they're even giving directions to black men in the crowd to do things. I've seen video of this.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So
well,
there are provocateurs. There is no doubt that there are provocateurs. But every single community has this. We have our own local anarchists here in Arizona, in Phoenix, and they're part of the same game there. You have this sort of merging, right? There's the Black Lives Matters folks. Their sort of movement. Then you have anarchists. You have Antifa. You have all these different groups. Yeah, I don't think the KKK is involved. I really don't. That's just my gut reaction of what I've seen and everything like that. They're just not there. They're not present.
Yeah. Well, if I could throw up a website here, protestjobs.com. This was shared with me by high-ranking Republican officials who are so stupid that they saw this and didn't realize immediately that this is a hoax. This is a hoax. Professional protesters for your cause at protestjobs.com. Have a protest. It's a big yellow button. It's just so hilarious. We don't care what your political affiliation is. We connect our network of professional protesters. No need to worry about 1099s. I love it. Secret payment by Bitcoin, which isn't secret. Bitcoin isn't secret. We talked about this. If you want your transactions to be secret, you need to use the Ghost cryptocurrency, the best privacy coin out there, brought to you by anarchist and lunatic John McAfee. Which we're but okay. So this is obviously fake. Now, how do we know this is fake? Scroll down to the next section where it says lesson for the day. This website is fake. Oh my gosh. And it's an anti-Trump ad is what this is. They say Trump is a failure. There's 100,000 Americans dead. You're doing Russia's work, which I guess is a reference to the whole Russia hoax thing. But I thought that it just gets funnier the more you go down. The protest packages, $99 per rioter or $129. So they can't decide if they're protesters or rioters. I think it's so funny. So for $500, you get the easy riot. But for $129 per protester, you get the best value protest. And I did the math. That's about $200,000 for their best value. So that should have been, if you can do basic arithmetic, that perhaps should have been a clue. Car/dumpster fire upgrade option available. Please call. Oh, that's so funny. And there are 3 fake protesters. Well, 2 are protesters and 1 is, I guess, somebody who's hiring a riot, renting a riot from these people. Feather Wilson says she can do 3 protests a year and have shopping money for when she goes out with the gals. Isn't that nice? And Lawrence Spears here says, I was even the president's black guy at one event. How cool is that? So, if you saw this and you didn't immediately know this was a hoax, and Arizona's National Committee woman, Lori Klein Corbin, did not know this was a hoax because she's a genius. This is the kind of stuff that I've been batting down all week. Just it's not just mayors and presidents. Anybody can fall for this kind of thing. And there is a kernel of truth there, that there are instigators out there, people who are kind of professional protesters in a metaphorical sense. They're professional protesters. They're out protesting all the time. But that doesn't mean that you can actually make a living protesting. That would not be a very cost-effective way to make a living. So I think that's all I have.
I think that's a good example of what happens when people search for information to basically support their own narrative. In other words, a lot of people are not truth seekers. They want to find information that only advances the way they're already thinking. And I think, if anything, that's what our show is trying to break. We're trying to break that mold, trying to think differently. And that's why I'm trying to make connections where other people are not. Because the fact of the matter is, people constantly just want to advance their own narrative. And so they will find the information to confirm what they already think. They're going to find it. They'll find it out there somewhere, because all the internet is information. Information is neither good, it's neither good nor bad. It's not truth, and it's not necessarily false. It's all of that stuff. And as a reasonable thinking human being, you have to decipher it and realize what's fact and what's fiction. And you have to be objective to do that. If you are extremely subjective and you are a slave to your passions and a slave to your emotions, which so many people are on both sides of every issue, that's what happens. You just find things that will fit into your own narrative. You will not be a truth seeker. You will not look at things objectively.
Yeah, and the media has gotten a lot of things wrong throughout this event. Gosh, where do you even start with that? There was one thing. If you could throw this up on the screen, the headline is "Phoenix Police Fire Tear Gas at Protesters Downtown," and I'm sure that did happen. I mean, you have protesters, you had rioters. They caused $300,000 worth of damage, damaged at least 18 buildings. Now, what's really interesting about this story, though, is not even this is a pretty common story that you've seen all over the country, in Salt Lake City and Chicago, Miami, LA, Minneapolis, everywhere. You've seen stories like this. But the original headline, this is not the original headline of the story. Because if you look at the URL, the address, it says, "Protesters in Phoenix attack police station." So the original headline of the story was "Protesters attack." And yeah, Zachary Stone just commented, "Information on the internet can be bad and can be good. People can twist information, display it to serve their own purposes." That's absolutely true. And unfortunately, you have the media getting things wrong. And I think there was sort of an appetite for people to digest, to get a hold of stories of police officers being attacked. But of course, most of these rioters, these protesters, they don't want to fight the police. You don't want to fight somebody who has a gun, who might be able to shoot back at you. You want to go after unarmed businesses and business owners, people who are easy targets and easy victims. And we've talked about this on the phone. These protesters, they're going after innocent businesses. Why are they doing it? What's the political message? What's the political purpose of all of this? And the answer is, they're trying to make a statement, but they're not brave enough to go after the people that they would actually blame for George Floyd's death. They're not willing to go after the mayor. They're not willing to go after the city council or the police officers, because they know they will get shot. It doesn't take much to disperse a crowd. If one person gets shot, that crowd is dispersed.
Yeah, it's interesting how you talked about the original headline of this particular article. It's interesting how that kind of thing happens, because I think it happens quite a bit. I've actually previously, I was going to show the fact that on this article on CNN, this happens all the time. There'll be the way that the article is listed on the main site, and that's the clickbait. That's the thing you're supposed to click on, and then so often you click on it, and then the actual headline's completely different. I mean, it's similar, but it's different. And the clickbait was meant to get you to go to the site, right? But it's so misleading. And then once you read the article, you find out, if you actually read the article, that's not what it said. That's in fact, the instance I remember, and I talked to you about it off the air, was there was one where they were talking about this drive-through graduation ceremony at a high school, and this was on CNN. And basically, the clickbait part on the main page made you think that these high school students got COVID from going to a drive-in graduation ceremony. Then when you read the actual article, first of all, the headline was different for the actual article. And then when you read the article, it turned out it was most likely they got the COVID from going to a party after the ceremony. And that's basically what the article said. It was
Right.
so misleading. It was just so misleading.
Yeah. Well, certainly in this story, that clickbait is what got me there. As I was looking, hey, are people attacking police officers? Are people attacking police stations? What's going on? Are police officers safe? Because I wanted to know. And there was no retraction. There was it pull is back now. Yeah, I've heard that too. That is absolutely just what we needed. Murder hornets, monkeys who are strong and self-replicating. It's like the robot uprising, the singularity. But this is so crazy that news is happening so fast. So much of it is false. And yet there's no retraction, there's no apologies. The media doesn't back down. They don't say, hey, that attack at that police station, that didn't happen, sorry, my bad. They'd already syndicated that. And the people who retracted it were the other outlets that had been caught holding the bag, because they'd already copied the content. So they weren't getting the updates from the Washington Times. All they had was the original bogus story, which they had to say, nope, that didn't happen.
And that's a good lesson for us, because I do rely quite a bit on other people's reporting, and sometimes it's false. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
that's the unfortunate thing when you don't have access to your own field reporters and the like. Zachary Stone says, yeah, the media has really frustrated me the past few months more than usual. I believe the curtain has been pulled back to show how much the media is just looking for views and not actually present. They don't want to actually present the news. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, Zachary. I think that's absolutely true. In fact, one thing I kind of want to just mention that I think is really interesting is, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a narrative going out where a lot of media outlets are talking about police are targeting them. Okay, they're saying police are targeting them, like they got shot with pepper spray, they got shot with rubber bullets. I have literally seen at least three or four live broadcasts where a member of the media was basically being attacked, pushed, shoved, grabbed by protesters. Okay, seen this live. I even saw it, I think, on ABC, their 6 o'clock news or 5 o'clock news, the network news. There was a reporter that was attacked, and there was an incident in Arizona where there was a female reporter where a guy grabbed her and tried to get her mic away from her. And there was an incident in my community in Scottsdale where a security guard was actually physically beaten up during that attack on Scottsdale Fashion Square. And that's not the narrative. That's happened. I mean, there's no doubt that protesters have specifically targeted media, but the only thing you hear about is, oh, the police are doing that. I just think that's interesting, as far as just trying to get that narrative going without actually even reporting what's happening to them, what's actually happening to them.
Right. Yeah, completely asymmetric. That when police attack a reporter, of course, it's front page news. But the fact that you have lots of reporters that are being attacked by these rioters, these protesters, and somehow that's not newsworthy, absolutely mind-blowing. Now, we've talked a lot about fake news, and you had some stuff on Section 230, which, of course, impacts whether or not you're allowed to publish fake news on the internet, and how that should be policed. Did you want to throw that up there, Eric?
Yeah, I actually have the content of Trump's executive order regarding the Section 230, which I thought was really interesting, because this is something that should have been, and it was for a little bit. It was big news for a little bit, but then, the news cycle obviously kind of, moved on with everything else that's been happening. And this is something that can have major repercussions for how the internet is utilized in the future. And it's a really interesting order. I'm going to make sure that I include this in the YouTube version of the show, so that if people want to look at the actual text of the executive order, they're able to do that. But it's very interesting, because if you kind of get down to the meat of this, and sort of the the enforcement section, if you will, of this. So it says protecting federal taxpayer dollars from financing online platforms that restrict free speech. It says that the head of each executive department agency shall review its agency's federal spending on advertising and marketing paid to online platforms. Such reviews shall include the amount of money spent, the online platforms that receive federal dollars, and the statutory authorities available to restrict their receipt of advertising dollars. That's a pretty interesting thing. I haven't heard anybody talk about that.
No, I haven't, but it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It makes perfect sense to me, anyway.
Because you have the military, like you think about the Marines or the Army, they have recruitment advertisements probably on Facebook. I mean, normally I see them on TV or something like that. But why, if these platforms are acting in a way that we feel is un-American or not in keeping with our values, should we be advertising on them? I mean, we would not want, say, the military advertising on the Chinese TikTok platform, for example, because obviously that's a Chinese owned and it's it's part of their spy apparatus, and so we don't want to support that. I'm not saying that the government should be cracking down on any of these organizations. I'm not saying that the federal government should be trying to restrict Facebook or Twitter from operating in the way that they want to. But when it comes to our tax dollars, obviously we should not be supporting censorship.
No, and it's interesting. This executive order references China numerous times as well, which is also interesting. And of course, China does engage. I mean, there's no denying that China engages in deceptive practices on the internet, and they're able to get away with it in large part because of money, because they're able to pay for ads and basically put the content on there that they want. And it's a fact that many of these big tech companies have been helping China in many of their programs, particularly with social credits and things like that. That's not conspiracy. That's a fact. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's very dystopian. Yeah, your ability to get on a train, your ability to go to the store, whatever it is you want to do, move around your town, is affected by the score that the Chinese state has given you. Are you a good citizen or a bad citizen? You have more rights if you're a good citizen, meaning you're compliant, and you have fewer rights if you don't. To kind of switch gears here a little bit, because there's quite a bit of controversy though over Section 230, and I think that part of the executive order we're all on board with. But the part that's kind of controversial is, if you could throw it up, I have it on the other screen here. Thank you. This is Justin Amash has put out a number of tweets, but this one was I thought summed it up the best. Who said, "Who originated the false claim that an entity is exclusively a publisher or a platform under Section 230 with different liability depending on the type of entity? 95% of the confusion on this subject stems from the misstatement of the law." And I think he's absolutely hit the nail on the head here. Obviously, he's not the biggest fan of Trump. He's the only, a former Republican now, who voted to impeach the president. And he is a lawyer. So he does know, when he starts talking about the law, especially this type of law, I think he knows exactly what he's talking about. It just makes sense. If you owned a bar, okay, this is the analogy I've sort of had incubating is, if you have a bar, you don't want people dealing drugs inside of your bar, probably, because that's not the kind of clientele you want to have. But if you apply the logic of Section 230, or at least this understanding of Section 230, if you start kicking people out because they're dealing drugs or doing something else that's unsavory, illegal, what have you, then you are responsible for everything that anybody does in your bar. Well, that's obviously crazy, right? Because you may not know what everybody in your bar or restaurant or whatever is doing. And if you scale this up to something like Twitter or Facebook, Twitter and Facebook have no idea what many people are doing. And a lot of people say, oh, it's unfair, and the way the policies are applied is unfair. And I absolutely agree with that. Of course it's unfair. They view conservative or right-wing harassment to be more of a threat than left-wing harassment. So if you're right of center, if you're a conservative and you violate their policies or are perceived to have violated their policies, they're going to crack down on you, even if it's very obviously a joke, for example, so not a true threat, which is what a lot of these boil down to. Whereas if Kathy Griffin makes a joke about wanting to inject the president with a needle, so to kill him because you inject him with a needle with air, that will kill you. Now, is she really going to do that? Is that a true threat? Well, it's not. She's a comedian. But Carl Benjamin, who is a political commentator, but he does it in a comic way. It's funny. People understand. He is telling jokes for the most part. He was banned from Twitter for joking about throwing somebody out of a helicopter, which was a reference to something that happened in Chile back in the 1970s. So when conservatives make jokes, we get kicked off the platform. When liberals make jokes, hey, it's just a joke, man. It's not fair. And the thinking is, well, that means they're not entitled to Section 230 protection. I would say, actually, the court cases that led up to Section 230 being put in place were simply wrong-headed. If you think about the logic of holding a platform that allows people to publish stuff, right? They may have policies, but they can't be 100% gatekeepers. They can't be certain nobody will ever publish something bad on their platform, because if they did, they would have to moderate everything, which means that when you try to publish a tweet, it's going to take at least, I don't know, an hour, a day to get published. So it's not even real time anymore. Is that the kind of world we want to live in, where we regulate these social media companies so strictly that social media ceases to be social? Because I think
I'm not sure how social it actually is anymore, to be honest with you, Pete. I like to call it anti-social media.
Well, I think there's something to that. Because obviously there is still a lot of harassment on social media, but the fact is it is real time. We had a conversation with Senator Ted Cruz the other day on Twitter, where we got 600 views on Twitter. That's the kind of power that anybody can have right now in social media. But if it's no longer live, you won't have that kind of dynamic. If it's no longer live, then suddenly the kind of conversations that we're having in real time with people all over the world, we were talking about the space shuttle earlier this week. Isn't it amazing? We can all enjoy this moment together. Well, how can you have that if social media has to slow down to have every single thing moderated? What I would like to see is, people always talk about the algorithms, how the algorithms are bad and wrong. I would like to see algorithms that try to optimize these platforms for maximum traffic and access. Because if you have a big audience, if people are going to your site, that means that it must be something that people actually like. Isn't that, that's pretty objective, right? And yet that's not how they do it. They do have a lot of human moderation of these comments. And
apparently they have much less of that because of COVID-19. In fact, I just did a complaint on somebody's comment because I thought they were inciting violence, and the message that I got back immediately from Twitter was, yeah, we've got less people monitoring this stuff, so good luck with that. Essentially, you know what I mean? I'm paraphrasing, but yeah. I want to get back to Section 230 real quick. I also want to acknowledge Zach again, because he did agree with me that it is anti-social media. So, hey, when I get some public backing, I've got to use it. And he says it's interesting that the only people who get blocked are those with a big platform. That's an interesting observation, Zachary, because I've had that observation as well. That obviously a lot of people say really threatening things, but because they don't have a lot of followers, they don't get flagged. The algorithm never picks them up. I've noticed that as well, which I think is interesting.
And I suppose you're going to have fewer people reporting them, but it does work in favor. And not only people who are small platforms, but if you're publishing in a foreign language, that's going to be harder for Twitter or these platforms to filter. So groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, it's actually easier for them to fly under the radar than it is for somebody who's an American talk show host or the U.S. president to fly under the radar on these policies.
Yeah, that does make sense, although it does also show that the algorithm is clearly flawed, because if the algorithm worked, it would just flag everybody, and it doesn't. So I wanted to bring up Section 230 specifically, and this is from Cornell Law School. This is the actual text you know, 40, and it says findings. So what's interesting about this is basically telling you the intent of the law. This is why the law is in place in the why. And it tells you right here. So it says number one, the rapidly developing array of internet and other interactive computer services available to individual Americans represent an extraordinary advance in the ability of educational and informational resources to our citizens. Two, these services offer users a great degree of control over the information that they receive, as well as the potential for even greater control in the future as technology develops. Three, the internet and other interactive computer services offer a forum for a true diversity of political discourse, unique opportunities for cultural development, and myriad avenues for intellectual activity. This is the section that I want to focus on here because it's very clear what the intent there, where they're coming from. It says the internet and other interactive computer services offer a forum for a true diversity of political discourse. I don't know how much more black and white you can make it, because when you look at a law and the interpretation of a law, I've always been taught, I think this is going away more and more every day, but you're supposed to look at the intent of the law, not just the actual verbiage of the law, but why it is that they made that law in the first place. And here in black and white is at least part of why they did. There are additional sections to this.
Now, who produced this?
This is from Cornell University. This is the actual text of the 47 U.S. Code 230. This is the text of the code. This
okay.
Is just the straight
when
text
you say
of the code.
This is the intent, I mean, who is interpreting the intent here is my question.
Congress. These are the findings of Congress. This is the background for why they passed the law. When they pass a section like this, and I realize people don't read these sections. There are tons and tons of federal sections of laws and titles and codes. So obviously this is Title 47 and it's Section 230. That's why we say Section 230. It's Section 230 of Title 47 of the U.S. Code. This is the actual text of the law. It's similar to like when you see the emergency declarations and they say, whereas blah, 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 whereas blah, 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 whereas blah, blah, blah. They provide a context and basically tell you why this order is being put into effect. Well, they do the same thing with laws. And this is an example of that. So it tells you there that this was part of the intent of the law, was that it was that they understood that the internet should be and had this incredible potential to be a forum, quote, for a true diversity of political discourse. And I think what a lot of the frustration is when it comes to what the internet companies are doing right now is this platform publisher debate, if you will. It's not specifically said in the law. They don't identify a platform. They do talk about publishers, but they don't. But that's the interpretation because people understand what the intent was. And the intent, in my mind, of Section 230 was to basically, first of all, it has a lot to do with actual child protection and sexual, exploitation of minors. There is a big part of that involved with Section 230. They wanted to make sure that, data mining didn't happen and things like that. So there's a huge element of that. But the other part of Section 230 was to allow the internet to be treated as a medium, to be treated as a way of communicating, and to not treat these particular entities, these service providers, they didn't want to treat them as publishers. That's the idea. That's the intent. That's the easiest way to understand it. They wanted to make sure that they were considered to be a platform, that they were considered to be something like, I saw somebody do a post on Twitter that I thought was really interesting, where he said, think about if you were basically had to be fact checked when you were using the phone, if you had to be fact checked, every time that you sent a letter, you know what I mean? I think that is actually a very good way to think about it. And Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all these different anti-social media platforms, they need to think, do I want to be the mail? Do I want to be a phone? Or do I want to be Simon & Schuster? Do I want to be HBO? Do I want to be Disney Plus? Who are you? And as a society, we have to decide that as well. this is, I think, is a relevant debate.
Well, they are to some degree a little bit of both, and that's what's really interesting. And that's why these laws. I think a lot of these lawsuits are, frankly, a lot of these questions have been solved just in other contexts. So again, to go back to Justin Amash, he says Twitter is not immune from being sued for defamatory content it creates. This argument by Donald Trump and his Senate defenders about Section 230 that Twitter can't be sued for defamation is false. It is treated the same as CNN. I think that's a really interesting point, because you have these platforms that are sort of a hybrid, that they are producing some content, but a lot of the content is auto-generated. And so his point is, what Twitter says they should be held responsible for things they don't say they should not be held responsible for, which is just common sense. Whether or not Section 230 exists, it is kind of mind-blowing that any court thought that it was proper to hold these platforms responsible for content that they did not create. That they weren't necessarily aware of, that they didn't moderate. And I guess the thinking is, if you have, say...
I want to point that out, that's kind of where the publisher thing comes from. Because it's to me, it's the easiest way to explain how the system actually works. Because if you're a publisher, you don't necessarily create the content either. As a publisher, you're not the author, right? There's a difference. And that's why words matter. So if you're a publisher, that doesn't mean you like Simon and Schuster. They didn't write the book. An author wrote that book, right? They are simply the publisher, but they are still held liable as the publisher. That's the difference. That's when it comes to, because this stuff gets really complicated. When you talk about things like entertainment law and intellectual property and all that kind of stuff, which is really a great deal of what we're talking about here. It gets very complicated. And Section 230 was a specific protection for internet service providers and internet providers of various kinds, and it has shielded YouTube and Twitter. And I mean, think about YouTube. YouTube would be knocked out of existence if they were actually held to that standard as a publisher of all the copyrighted material that gets put on YouTube constantly, which they're constantly also trying to take down. But that's probably the best example I can give, is they would go out of business in 5 minutes if they were held liable for all that pirated content that's put on their platform.
Right. Yeah, and they do try to take down pirated content, and I don't think any sane person objects to them doing that, right? We want them to take down pirated content because somebody had to pay to produce that.
Do we? Because I know a lot of people that love that pirated content, and that's why they went to YouTube in the first place.
There's an audience for it. Yeah, there's an audience for it. But just as we don't want people dealing drugs in your bar, just as we don't want people. So here's a very clear example where Backpage.com was shut down, put out of business in large part because of Kamala Harris and other thugs who misused the law. Backpage.com was trying to be just a platform, but they did have rules. You weren't allowed to engage in human trafficking, not allowed to advertise for underage people engaging in non-consensual behavior, things like that, right? They were trying to be good citizens and uphold the law, and they got absolutely railroaded because what would happen was they would set up filters that would look for inappropriate content, illegal services, let's say, on their website. And then people would figure out a way to get around it. They'd create a code to communicate to each other, and the code would just keep changing. And so what they eventually said was, okay, we're not going to micromanage this anymore. If people are going to do that, there's not a lot we can do. We've tried to make the rules, we've tried to moderate it, and people just keep getting around the rules, and it's just just on a treadmill. So what we're going to do is, when the police say to us, hey, do you know who published this ad that is clearly code for something that is, illegal? It's an illegal ad. They would help them. They were more than willing to be an open book. Yes, we know exactly who published that ad. This is the credit card they use. This is who we think this person is. This is their IP address and where we think their location is. And they would help the police. But that wasn't enough. So the publishers, both these people from Phoenix, Arizona, were arrested now multiple times, and they've gotten out of jail and gone back, and it's a real mess. But basically, it comes down to this publisher platform distinction. The authorities want to hold them accountable for content that they did not produce and that they have made a good faith effort to moderate, but have not been able to moderate to the extent that, you know, we as a society or the police department would like to do, even to their own satisfaction. They were not able to moderate it. But to say then, okay, because you moderated the platform insufficiently, we're going to take away your protections or we're going to throw you in jail, to me is absolute madness. And it shows how these courts are out of control, how these prosecutors are out of control, because the internet is this new thing and we're acting like these are new questions. These are not new questions. Our legal system is approximately 1,000 years old now. We have asked questions about responsibility. You know, if somebody is a contractor, for example, producing content for you, how much responsibility do you have for that? Well, it depends. It depends on how much oversight. It depends on if you could have foreseen that they were going to publish something that was inciting violence, whatever it is. We have asked these questions. They have been answered in court. Why isn't Chris Hansen arresting them? You know, the police have made many arrests on the basis of information they've gotten from the Backpage.com corporation. Chris Hansen didn't have to get involved, but yeah, the founders of the Phoenix New Times and Backpage.com, which was a spinoff, they did help put many people who were hurting young girls in prison, and good. And they gave money to a shelter to help, you know, people who were trapped in that lifestyle get out of that lifestyle. So, oh goodness. You know, I don't have any information about that, Zachary. I would have to learn more about that. But you know, that is a gray area, isn't it? If you are entrapping people, what are the ethics and what are the legalities of that? I'm not entirely sure. But
I can say off the top of my head,
best.
I can say off the top of my head, I don't think there is such a thing as entrapment for someone unless they are directly working with law enforcement. In other words, it's the government agent test is the easiest way I can explain it. It's the same thing like when you talk about an illegal search. I always like to use the Batman analogy. So if Batman goes and searches in a criminal's lair and finds something that's incriminating and gives it to the police all on his own, theoretically that could still be used in court. But if Commissioner Gordon tells Batman to go into the crook's lair and take some evidence because they can't get it, now he's a government agent, and that becomes what they call fruit of the poisonous tree. And I think that's the same thing with entrapment, because entrapment obviously is just another form of evidence. So those are kind of the ways that the rules of evidence work. So if you're in the case of Chris Hansen, right, he was working as a journalist, right, doing To Catch a Predator and things like that. And as long as he wasn't quote unquote a government agent or working on behalf of a government entity as a quote unquote government agent, the rules are different. Does that make sense? So
yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. I don't know if that's the case with Chris Hansen, by the way. I don't claim to be an expert on it. I'm just saying that general principle I would think would apply to him, just as it would apply to any journalist who isn't quote unquote working for a law enforcement entity. He's not working for the government. You know what I mean? So
yeah. I haven't heard that there's any investigation into him in regards to that. But well, he's something of a controversial figure. Well, we're kind of hitting the our break here, the end of our time. Is there anything you'd like to add before we sign off, Eric?
Well, I did want to say thank you, Zachary, and thank you, NC Fisherman. And I think we even had another one, but I just want to thank you guys for commenting and being part of the show today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, so do I. Well, my name is Pete Maines. As always, I'm here with my co-host, Eric Alexander. And until next week, you guys keep flying free.